Welcome everyone. So we're going to have this panel session, and we have people from various places in the organizations and supply chains and so on. And I came up with this wonderful mouthful of a panel session here that we have. So my name is Joachim Beck. I'm from Linaro. Been there for 12 years or something now. It's security background and so on. We have Kate from Linux Foundation, pioneer in SPDX, SBOM and other things and so on. Marta, as you saw this morning, a lot of knowledge about Cybersecurity Act. Mike, the experts of confidential computing and so on. So we wanted to touch a little bit on Cyber Resilience Act probably as the kind of the main theme, but going into kind of interoperability, supply chains and so on. So Marta, if I kind of start with you, I mean, you have already given answers to quite a few of the things, but I mean, if I'm a small business, where should I get started? It's so many things to look at the same time.
So if you're a small business, the first thing I would tell you to do is to figure out who you are under this CRA. Yeah. Because you may be a manufacturer if you are selling some devices of software products, but it's not necessarily like that. You may be also open source steward, or maybe you may be just a contributor, and your obligations in all of those cases, they are absolutely not the same. So and your obligations and your position for every single software or hardware product you have may not be the same. Mm-hmm. So the first, do the inventory of all the products and decide who you are. That will be the absolutely first thing. Yeah?
I was just going to say, and also, I've spent far too much time looking at the CRA as well. Mm-hmm. There are specific provisions for manufacturers who are small businesses as well. Yeah. So it may be different for that as well. Mm-hmm. Mm.
So what about you, Mike, in that case, from coming from like the confidential computing? How does this affect, I mean, what's the tie into CRA? That seems to be a little bit convoluted and complex as well. So
I think there's different types of tie-ins. There's kind of, firstly, one of the big use cases for confidential computing, which I mentioned earlier on, is for software supply chain, and in fact hardware supply chain. Mm-hmm. So it may be that you want to be using confidential computing to create things like SBOMs, right, which are mentioned explicitly in the CRA as one of the forms of evidence that you may be presenting as the literature that you quite rightly pointed out was important for your compliance documentation. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The second thing is that you may be using confidential computing as a control to meet some of the obligations of the CCC in your product, in your PDE. We didn't spend enough time talking about the exciting products with digital elements, PDEs, yes, which is what the CRA refers to. So if your product is using confidential computing to protect what you're going on, then that's important. And it may mean that you're pushed into a specific classification within the Act, which changes your obligations. Mm-hmm. Do you want to go a bit about that?
There's one more thing. The CRA is asking you to do the risk analysis.
Yep.
And that may make clear for some people if they need to use a kind of confidential computing, if the risk analysis show that they cannot, for example, trust their cloud vendor.
I really like that. I tend to think of it, well, you should always be using CC for everything because that's kind of my job, right, is promote it. But you're quite right. It's about risk. Yeah. And a lot of the CRA is really about understanding risk to your customers and to you in your supply chain. And if you do a risk analysis and you find that you have particular requirements, they may be best or most easily met with confidential computing. There are other options as well, but you're quite right. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, moving from what's my risk profile to how can I best meet that. Yeah.
And I think the other part that's coming into play here is your product may be someone else's component.
Yes.
And so it doesn't really go all the way down to the end user. So we do have a supply chain that has to come into effect. We do have obligations we've got to figure out how can we make our components or our products that are going into components in other places as easy to work with from the risk analysis point of view as possible. Certainly getting this stuff allocated, surfacing exactly what you've got, like SBOMs, technologies that way, are a part of this story. But also understanding obligations for being a third party participating in something. Like there's the manufacturers, integrators, and distributors called out as special roles. And so understanding how you're, to Martha's initial point, understanding what your real role is here and how you interface with users is a start of figuring out how to navigate through all of this.
And importers and open source stewards and
Yes.
contributors
Yes.
and MRA. Yes. So if you fancy trying to get to sleep one night, having a read of the CRA is a great way to do that.
Wonderful.
I've been reading it in trains, and I was thinking that I will fall asleep when no.
You didn't.
No,
You kept you
absolutely, I
wide
didn't
awake.
fall asleep.
You just get more and more scared,
And
huh?
there's some interesting
there
things.
were a lot of interesting parts I've read.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What I was finding quite interesting, and I don't know how it's all going to shake out, is the classifications of products and how components in some things like operating systems can be in even the highest assurance levels, which have to go through formal audit. And so how we get these components working in an effective supply chain here is
And
going to be an
then-
interesting challenge.
And just trying to figure out what are the classification of the different things. I
Maybe-
mean, they have some guidelines already written in the, I mean, the specifications and such, but still, I mean, there are kind of maybe nuances, and you don't really know where should it class 2 critical or where
Well,
should it be. and
should
so
we
on.
briefly explain what the different
Please.
ones are, if I
Do.
can remember? So there's your standard products, right?
Yeah.
And then there's, next is important products, and they
Class
are class
1
1
and
and
class-
class 2.
Right.
And then there's critical, which are different. So the standard products, basically, in most cases, you can do self-compliance. You can do internal, and you can provide materials as required, but you don't need to send them out to an external auditor or compliance mechanism to do that. Class 1, what examples of class 1? Class 1,
Operating
baby
systems.
monitors.
Operating systems,
But
yes.
baby monitors as well fall under that as well, don't they? Are they
I don't know if it's the class 1 or class 2.
so this is the problem. Though.
There is the whole annex that is listing all of that.
Yeah.
Except that there's
yeah.
now work going on to refine that list
Yeah.
and make it better, which is good. So things like an HSM is clearly critical, right? That's critical. That's in the
Smart cards are critical.
smart cards,
cards,
HSMs, things
Things,
like that.
things with finance seem to go into the critical one,
Exactly.
like bank card and
Yeah.
you know,
So
things like that.
the things that require the most security and providing the most security and are most likely to cause problems for other components if they go wrong tend to be in the critical, and those are the ones that are going to need the most work and need to be addressed the most. But you're quite right that knowing where things sit is not an easy decision to make. And I think that certainly to start with, as we're refining this, erring on the side of caution and speaking to the EU and saying, well, to whichever part you're saying, we're not sure, shall we do this, is going to be safer for everybody.
Yeah, and there's like if you end up in one of the kind of easier classes, that is basically a set certification, I guess.
Yeah.
But if you have to like have third party, then suddenly it's starting to become something that can become costly as well. So it's
Yeah. One of the things I liked about Marta's presentation was, she talked about the importance of getting everything worked out and knowing what you're doing and the processes. And frankly, you should be doing everything to such a state that if you needed to do external certification, you could, right? You should have all the materials, you should have all the processes, you should have everything written out and made available and automated, hopefully, so that if you did decide you need, or if your lawyers, heaven help you, decided that you needed to be going externally, you could do that. So get it right from the start, frankly.
And you need to keep all that documentation for at least 10 years.
At least 10 years, yeah.
I know already there are some people who may be tempted to say, okay, we can generate SBOMs, so we are not going to generate them now. We are going to generate when some agency asks us to do it. don't do that.
Yeah, you keep it, even if you don't publicize it, keep it internally, know exactly what you've got, because that is the root of reproducibility, which is what you're going to need to be able to do.
Yeah.
Can you just share some insight about what kind of documentation are we talking about here?
Yeah, so basically, the whole documentation that, the security documentation of your product, so depending on which category you are, either the self-attestation, that's mostly your processes, the evidence that you have followed the whole thing, the SBOM, but also all the security updates that you provide, you need to keep them. And absolutely, that's something that you should have been doing already, because we all know many cases when something went wrong in a product after a series of updates.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do not have all of them to reproduce the situation, that you cannot debug that problem. So you should have been doing it already.
Ideally, every time you update and apply a patch, you should generate a new SBOM, just to say, and you should basically have ways of linking. You need to know exactly what your inventory of what's actually being shipped is and the relationships between the elements in there, because they will change. And quite frankly, you should be recording your tool chain and environment for building it, because 10 years down the road, you may need to reproduce it.
Yeah, and half of the team has already changed.
Oh, half the team?
Yeah, if there's a team at all.
Right, because, you know, a lot of the challenges are going to be on things like when we have mergers and acquisitions happening in this type of environment, and there's responsibility that's been accumulated. The other big factor that's not really called out there, but I'm quite frankly worried about, is the data sets and the training of models.
Yeah.
Because we're moving into that space, and the Act isn't covering that. Now, there's a EU AI Act that touches about some of that, but the same way source code is ingredients on packages today, data sets are effectively ingredients on training and models tomorrow.
One of the, I think, critical, certainly it's class 2, is firewalls and things like that. And if you have a firewall which has AI trained capabilities, then that's part of the input, right? So how do you record that? What do you do with it? I don't have a good answer.
Well, so there's ways of doing it in the BOMs, like in build material type of structure. And so that's one of the things we've got in SPDX, and the newest release of SPDX is ways of recording the data sets and then having the chains of provenance for as they've evolved and also as they've been applied to training models. So we've got the language for using that, but we don't have the tooling at a state where it's usable right now. And so it's something that's going to we're going to need to have that full transparency, not just on the software and the hardware, but the entire system of a product. And that's what we have to apply for safety, and so that's why I've been focusing on the bigger issue here.
Another of Marta's things, sorry, again, you just sitting there nodding.
Self-going, it's great. It's like
I heard a bit of a gasp when she said it, was that if you have 1,000 components, you need to be able to track all of them. And the gasp should be, well, surely everyone does that already. Why would you not do that, right? But now you need to prove that you're doing it.
Every FOSDEM on my security talk, I ask people how many of you know how many OpenSSL versions you have in your product.
That's a great one.
The statistic is improving from one FOSDEM to another.
The number of people who lie to you when you put
It's improving, but still we are reaching a majority.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's
for
good.
OpenSSL.
Just for one component.
Yeah, let's talk XZ. Something that has absolutely no security impact whatsoever, right?
But yeah.
So I was thinking about that during our presentation, where you said, like, if you have 1,000 products in your product, and you're still kind of obliged to fix the issues, even if you don't get any response. Don't we end up with a kind of a fragmented, fixed version ecosystem in that case?
Yes.
That could happen, but it's also a chance for vendors to review the whole of their supply chain amongst all of those projects and all of the products that they have, and to figure out how many libraries using doing the same thing they have and go to something that is well maintained, that they can actually manage. Even better, if the upstream has a sane, stable version policy, so that the APIs do not break all the time. And that's something that you can upgrade easily in your product, submit patches, they accept it immediately or not immediately, but everything applies nicely. If you have abandoned or forked projects that you use, that you cannot really update, you are going to half-bake the fix, and then there will be another fix 2 years later. That's really going to be a nightmare. So people are not much doing that right now. We already got through the SBOM situation. We already got to the vendors checking for licensing.
Right?
Yes.
So if the license is fine, I can include it. There's something more that we need to do. Not only the license is fine, I include it, but the security policy of that component is fine, then I include it.
Yeah.
I'd go one further, which is to say, this is an opportunity, yes, to find all of those things, to find, are the things that you're using maintained? Do they have security policies? But it's also an opportunity for something that we should have been doing anyway, which is saying, if I'm using a project and I depend on it, either I need to get involved myself or get my people involved in it, or pay for someone to be doing that by joining a foundation or working with the Alpha Omega project at OpenSSF or something like, or even paying someone external myself, or deciding that it's time to move on to something else. And so I really hope that the CRA, and there are other, it's not just the CRA, there are other regulators coming out, pushes people to take a more involved, companies, to take a more involved stance within the open source community for the things they really rely on. Because without that, the open source community is going to die. And you can't afford, believe me, for the open source community to die around these things. It's not going to work.
The other thing that's probably going to come out as a side effect, or at least I'm hoping is people are actually going to pay attention to what's in their containers and only basically get it pulled down to what you actually need for products, so you don't have this huge attack surface and scope of things that are not generally called, and then be much more explicit about building things, which will be quite frankly more efficient, energy-wise as well as size-wise. But this transparency and this whole raft of dependencies hopefully will get people to examine and do their system analysis better than they have been doing recently. Right now it's, this container, I can put this, boom, shrub, and then you've got like 10,000 packages and dependencies, and you're going like, what? For a very simple function. And it was just because that was the easiest thing that the developer knew, but realistically, the scope of what they actually need, they could get with a couple of projects, put them together themselves, and have a much smaller attack surface.
So I'd love both of your thoughts on the amount of detail that you think the CRA requires around our build environments, or what it makes sense to provide, which is different things, right?
The CRA is just saying SBOM at this point in time, right? And the trouble is, we don't have a stable SBOM definition anywhere. Okay? Yeah. The one out of DUS and NTIA and CISA has shifted 3 times in terms of what they consider quote unquote to be an SBOM. The formal NTIA one is 1, but that doesn't have an integrity check, so I wouldn't go with that. Yeah. You need a hash and an integrity check. But then BSI is defining the set of fields that they think are important. The Japanese are defining the set of fields that they think are important.
BSI being the German.
Yeah, the German. And so, we've been interacting with them about the fields and how to express it in SPDX, for instance. And so the next rev of their things will have some fields that are not quote-unquote part of the normal. But we also see, like the FDA, it's expecting to have a supported life cycle. It formally indicated. That isn't in our minimum elements of an SBOM, but I think that's something that logically makes sense when we're talking support periods, because we need to be able to define that and make that surfaced for the supply chain to work.
So where is the urgency right now with SBOM? What's kind of the missing bits and pieces besides what you just mentioned?
So the missing bits and pieces with SBOMs are us switching from a focus on documents to a focus on BOM elements that go into databases so we can actually manage product lines at scale. You're starting to see a term of, basically about, too many bombs flying around, things like that. So you're seeing all this because people just get these documents and they don't know what to do with them because everyone's oriented about documents. But if you think of a document as just a snapshot of a point in time, as an organization, when I was working with ARM about 5 or 6 years ago, they were pulling in their the BOM stuff information as they were building up these SBOMs and so forth. They've been doing it for quite a while. And they were putting it into a database. So they had to put it into a database somewhere to catch this, to track it, to monitor it. And every organization needs to do that. So there's various elements, and we need to be able to have these elements in a way that's easily consumed into a database. And then tools can export SBOM documents to share between organizations or with other criteria. But each internal organization really needs to up their game in terms of how they're managing the metadata about the products they sell.
So consumability.
It's basically have it consumed in a way that you can then say, okay, I've got this element here. It's been changed into this element by applying this patch. It's been changed into this element by applying this patch. You've got everything date stamped. You know what state you were at across multiple projects, multiple dependencies at various points in time, because that's what's in there. So it's integrated into the CI flows. It's automatically integrated. I think that is the biggest challenge right now that is not quite in people's minds. It's system BOM information. It's not software, it's system we need to go towards.
I will add to that the fact that there are multiple SBOM standards, there are multiple generators, there are generators at the source level, there are generators at the runtime level, and you will have one product and components that you get one standard of SBOM, one standard, one way of generating of one component, something else for the second, third, fourth, and you are expected to make sense of all of that. And the tooling is not there yet.
Yeah, I would say the tooling's not there yet for accuracy.
What does Cybersecurity Act say about this, since they mandate SBOMs?
Nothing.
The Cyber Resilience Act says that you are expected to generate SBOM for only the highest level components, only one level. Yeah, it's only that. So for the complete analysis, that's not enough. But I can understand why they do that for basically commercial products.
Yep.
They lined it up with the NTIA reasoning.
Yeah. And they say that you are expected to use the SBOM for vulnerability management, but they do not say it's required neither.
I think we should talk a bit about the vulnerability management side.
Yes,
sorry,
that's actually close to my heart as well. Some of my Linaro friends know a lot about this, so I can see Dan is sitting here as well. So Dan and I, we kind of maintain the top level security issues at Trusted Firmware for all the different sub-projects and so on. And
so it's your fault then?
It's my fault.
Okay.
Blame everything on me, never on Dan. So, but we see that, I mean, they now have a 24-hour window when you're supposed to kind of report back to NISA and so on. And how is that going to work? I mean, frameworks,
and
who should do what?
And that's not 24 working hours either. This is 24 hours from when you become
Learn
aware.
about it,
Yeah. And I'm not sure. I think we need to work out. There's some very interesting work that's being published by Dell at the moment about what they're doing. They're being very open about what they're doing. Okay. If you're interested, the OpenSSF Global Cyber Regulatory Working Group, of which I'm co-chair, is doing some of that, but I can certainly point you at it. So Dell is trying to, not say best practice, but here's the practice that we're building internally to allow people to do that. And so they are thinking about it. But again, this is where you need to be, don't worry about it in 2 years' time, or 1.5 years' time for the vulnerability, because it's September 26th, right?
September 26th.
Worry about it now. Get things in place. Have a web account, an email account, which is always monitored. Work out what your vulnerability incident reporting looks like. Test it now. get your teams working on it now, because come 26th or whatever of September next year, and someone phones in or emails in or puts on a web form that they've found a major vulnerability in your product, and you don't know what to do, you didn't talk about the fines. The fines are sort of up to 2.5% of global turnaround.
Yeah, global
turnover.
worldwide income from the prior year.
Yeah, and that's global revenue. That's not profit, and it's not just in the EU. That is global. Think GDPR type level fines, and think about it now.
Yeah.
So it's, I can imagine.
At least the open source stewards do not have to worry about that aspect, as far as I can
No,
tell.
but they should be in a position where they can accept vulnerability
Information.
and patches, and hopefully be able to encourage the projects to do the right thing with it. Indeed.
Yeah.
What I would like to see is a system where if you use my open source component, you should be able to, in an easy way, to kind of report an issue. You get someone saying you have an issue with your product. Fine. You have a channel so you can actually get it all the way back to the source.
Exactly, and sorry. Okay.
No, I was going to say that's actually one of the things we had to think about in Zephyr about 4 or 5 years ago now. We got a bulk vulnerability report because someone paid for an audit of us. And we didn't pay for it. We learned about it, though. And we had about 19 vulnerability things. So we really had a strong look at our processes. And one of the challenges is we have no way of letting our people who are consuming Zephyr, because Zephyr's open source, you have no way of knowing who's using it.
Yeah.
So when we're supposed to notify our users, the closest we can do is give a place where people can self-register to be notified. So the Zephyr project makes available a service that if you're using Zephyr and you give us the evidence that you're using Zephyr in a product, you can self-register and we'll notify you when things are under embargo.
Yeah.
And then you can probably fix it. But we have a vulnerabilities emailing list. Everything gets funneled through there, so that's lined up for that. But we also have a way of basically pushing information back out to our users, which a lot of open source projects don't have. Like the open source projects don't have a good way of saying, hey, we know you're using it under embargo. Here's the information. And quite frankly, balancing people who are real legitimate users against bad actors is also a concern when it's embargo windows.
Yeah, there's with open source projects and the number of open source projects that the pickup product is using, it's even a challenge if there are mailing lists announcing security releases. It's even a challenge to figure out for every single of those projects what is the right mailing list on the right website when it's going to be announced that there is a security release that you should get. You will maybe monitoring the Git repositories. In many cases, there are mailing lists with announcement. It's just a challenge to monitor all of that so that you stay up to date.
And there's a danger that, for one or two of the projects you're using, it's just a junior developer who's put their own email address on there rather than putting it on a central thing as well. One thing I should say, Zephyr is a bit of a golden child, and they're very good at putting stuff up sooner rather than later and thinking about it seriously. But there are a number of things like OpenSSF's baseline project, which allows you to gives you some clues as to how to do some of this stuff. And if you're a developer, if you're kind of a one-person project, there's level 1. If you're sort of 10, 15, there's level 2. And if you're more than that, there's level 3. And the idea is it should be easy to meet these capabilities as that sort of size of project and understand what things. I really hadn't thought as much as I should about the outbound process. The inbound process is hard enough, but the outbound process of telling people is also really hard.
All right, so we have roughly 10 minutes left, and I would like to give the audience a chance to ask questions as well. So if we have any mic and questions, that would be great.
Hands are up. Okay.
Lots of
I know
hands.
some of these hands.
Yeah, I know too.
It's good to see that people are awake at least. So
That's
it's,
good.
Where's the time gone? That's just crazy.
yeah. So
You say your name as well. Is that?
Hello, hi. My name is Nikhil. Thanks for the great discussion. I would like to just, understand the implications of CRA and whether it would adversely affect the adoption of open source projects. The main advantage that open source projects give you is that you do not have to maintain the code that you do not write. But now it sort of enforces OEMs and vendors to do that.
Yeah, so the Linux Foundation did a survey the first quarter this year, and the results are 46% of all the manufacturers are passively relying on the open source upstreams for doing their security fixes, which is part of the challenge that's happening here in the ecosystem. I think the way the CRA Act is looking at it is people who are making money should be putting some skin in the game, okay? These open source projects aren't getting money from these things, and so I think it's a way of trying to put the incentives in place so that the open source, the people will hopefully contribute. If they're doing the fixes, they'll contribute and do the right thing by contributing the fixes upstream and balance things a bit better. But at the end of the day, open source is the fastest way to get things out to market. And I don't think it's going to make the open source go away, but hopefully it'll make it a stronger ecosystem.
And
I think that's hope.
From the other direction, if you are an open source project, a contributor and maintainer of that, and you're worried about this, well, this is a great opportunity to work out who your users are, how to get yourself a steward. Do you go to a company? Do you go to one of the foundations? How to make sure that you have the processes in place to make it easy to be consumed in a way that people, so things like the security baseline, but other ways. So there are opportunities here for open source projects who know they are important to say, okay, now I'm going to help make it easier for me to be consumed in ways which work with the CRA. I think that's worth it.
Yeah, one thing that we didn't talk about is that open source projects and projects under foundations, they do not affix the CE mark under the CRA.
Yeah, no, you can't.
All products will affix, even software, will affix the CE mark, and the CE mark got overloaded with the security requirements. So the final products will get the CE mark that will mean now that there are security requirements that have been met. If you are open source project, either without a steward or with a steward, you do not need to meet the whole set of requirements of the CRA. On the other hand, you do not affix the CE mark, and then the manufacturer that takes your software, during the due diligence, they will find out that this product doesn't have a CE mark, because if they get another product that has the mark, that's a kind of an attestation for them that it's following some security processes. But it doesn't prevent open source stewards and projects to do the whole paperwork that are equivalent of all that is necessary to affix the CE mark, and show that as a baseline higher level, or just a kind of a marketing information that this project is taking security seriously. We are open source, we do not affix the CE mark, but the whole documentation that is an equivalent is there. And of course, we accept contributions and also financial contributions to support the development.
Consumability again.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, to you, Dresden. Sorry. So, I would like to confirm or understand from confidential computing perspective specifically. So, none of the projects at this moment has an open source specification. So, even those which are open source, which have open source implementations, do not have open source specifications. And from cybersecurity perspective, I don't see how this works out. As an auditor or as a formal verification guy, I would like to understand how does this relate to, or how we can incorporate this requirement within the CRA that it should not only be just implementation, but also specification. I mean, talking about attested CLS, which is, as you indeed said, that's a main requirement of confidential computing. It doesn't work without that. There's no project at all which has attested TLS specification. How do we actually reason about security in this case? That would be my first topic of discussion. And the second one, there are some projects which are not open source, and confidential computing does not work without open source. So how do you see this in the light of open source spirit, and how does cybersecurity actually then work? What kind of guarantees do we actually claim when the verifier itself is closed source?
I'll try and be brief on some answers on that. So the first one is the CRA does look for documentation and specifically on risk assessment. And one could say that without specific levels of specification, then risk assessment becomes difficult to do sufficiently. I think that's probably the way I'd look at that one. In terms of the second one, yes, everything should be open source. It's kind of a trite answer, but when it comes down to it, the CRA doesn't specify you have to use open source, and CC, confidential computing, is not the only thing where you could argue that open source is really the only way to do it properly. So I'm obviously a huge proponent of open source, and I'd like to see everything open source, but when it comes down to it, it has to be the EU that makes the decisions about what it requires for compliance. And so we can encourage, but it comes down to it, we have to wait for the EU to make the decisions. Who's next?
Peter?
Yeah, so you spoke about all the scary things that businesses have to do to adhere to the CRA. You didn't go into any of the tooling that can assist them in dealing with that. Given there's open source for everything else, I'm guessing there is open source to assist with things like generating SBOMs and vulnerability audits and things like that. So it's all very well being scary.
It does.
But can you explain some of the toolings to make it easier for people?
So there's a lot of tooling out there, and there's various, in OpenSSF, we've got a little landscape of tools that you can go look at for various purposes. I think it's important to understand the types of SBOMs you're generating. Are you generating a source SBOM, which is your set of sources? Or are you generating the build SBOM? Or are you generating, quite frankly, a deploy SBOM where this is how you've configured it and put it out in the market, right? So there's a variety of tools out there, and they focus on pulling different parts of information. I'd say there's a lot of commercial offerings that do analysis SBOMs rather than getting the information. I think one of the biggest challenges is, quite frankly, the accuracy of the information when you've done heuristics and analysis, as opposed to generating it when it's actually known through the supply chain. So there's tooling out there. I would say the tooling is still a bit immature for what we really are going to need for this at scale, but at least it's moving in the right direction, and there's a lot of business interests around it. And some of these are companies that have commercial offerings, but also make their sources available too. So there's ways of engaging with improving things, especially when you see problems.
And we're trying to spin up a working group around tooling for the CRA and other cyber regulation. And if you'd be interested in being a co-chair of that, we'd love to speak to you, because we are actively looking for such a person. Find me later on.
You're signed up, Peter, for that role.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
I'm not signing myself up.
but
I know someone I could possibly throw under the bus that's not here.
Okay. Who's next?
Hello, I have a question. So this is Yun Tian from Rexa, and we're actually a device manufacturer. So I have two questions. So the first, does CRA only cover the software that are pre-installed on the device?
Any digital element.
Because we are actually making mostly single-board computers like Raspberry Pi, so they do not come with any software pre-installed, but the users are...
Does not Raspberry Pi come with firmware installed?
Firmware, microcode.
Firmware, microcode, that's software. It's a digital element. That's why they use the term product with digital elements.
They were very careful, so that covered.
So as far as Raspberry goes, I don't think they have any storage. I mean, they have like an EP room, but they don't have anything that user upgradable, I think.
Peter's decided.
But anyway, in our case, we do not have, for most of our products, we do not have any software saved on the system. Even we have a ZP flash, it usually stays empty.
But I guess you have something that needs to read from the flash as well, and that is some kind of software, I expect.
A bootloader of some sort.
Bootloader, yeah.
The bootloader is only the embedded in the chip itself.
Yeah,
Sure.
So
that's
we
a
don't even
digital
have
element.
That's a
Yeah, that counts.
That counts.
Because it
But
could,
that's
because
actually
it
like
could
part of the
introduce-
hardware, so it's not something that we have access to or something that we can even
Oh,
modify.
you do because you have access to suppliers. So you are basically saying that that supply is okay because you're selling it as such. So you need to be working with your upstream, which is in this case your
Supplier.
chip supplier, to ensure that,
You get the bombs.
that you got bombs.
Okay, so another question is that for a lot of the SoC vendors, they provide some kind of like Debian SDKs, which they will produce like a Debian system with a lot of packages from the Debian project itself.
Yep.
And we also maintain some kind of distros ourselves. So how does CRA like affects this kind of
Do
the
you,
responsibility for distros?
do you release those distros?
Yes, but we are also
For
like
money?
talking with Linaro recently with something like System Ready, where the user can just boot like upstream unmodified ISOs.
I would speak to your lawyers. I think it's going to get quite interesting. It may be that some of these it doesn't apply to, and others it does. So I would definitely speak to your lawyers, and rather than 3 semi-experts on a panel, none of whom are.
Thank you.
These guys are experts. Sorry, I'm just saying it.
All right. So we're out of time now, but I think this was a useful session, and I hope you learned things. I did. And thanks to Mike and Marta and Kate for attending and giving all the advice to us. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for the good questions.